Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is the Yevamot Daf Nun Bet. Today's daf is dedicated for Yom HaShoah in memory of all those who died in the Holocaust. Today's daf is also sponsored by Lenore Davis in honor of her parents, Rabbi Ruvi Davis Satzal and Susan Davis. They prioritize Torah learning in our home, and with this daf, I complete Shas. Mazal Tov. And this stuff is also sponsored by Caroline Ben Ari on the 12th yard side of her father, Ivor Rhodes, Yisrael Ben Meir Sarah. Dad was the quiet, undemonstrative member of the family. He was hardworking, caring, generous, and honest to a fault, a true gentleman with a wicked sense of humor and a lifelong addiction to puns. Today, I pledge to make as many terrible puns as I can in his honor. Okay, with that, we will get started with our daf. So to review, we said that we had the Mishnah at the beginning of the chapter. And we saw the Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis had a machloket. Is there get after get or ma'amar after ma'amar? And then we had a whole discussion about it yesterday trying to explain it. And then we had this seemingly strange thing in the Mishnah where the Mishnah then said, Ketzad, how does this work? And you expected the Mishnah to be telling you how is get achar get and how is ma'amar achar ma'amal. But in fact, that's not what the Mishnah talks about. It starts going to a case where he did ma'amal and then he gave a get. What does she need? He gave this, he did that. Everything like that, but not get achar get. It wasn't a case of get and then get and ma'amar and ma'amal. So the Gemara basically wants to understand that. So we're going to start with the last few words of Nun Aleph Amud Bet. Ketzad asa ma'amal. Okay, so that was exactly where they started with this ketzad. So now they say, hi get achar get who? In other words, again, we expected this to be a case of get achar get, but that's not what it says. It's not talking about get achar get. It's talking about ma'amal. And then what does she need? She needs a get, chalitza, etc. So Amar Rav Yehuda Hachi Kamar. Rav Yehuda says, this is how you should read the Mishnah. Get achar get u'ma'amar achar ma'amar in the first case that we discussed in the machloket, kid amran, as we said before, meaning, right, like we said yesterday, basically is what they're saying, as it was written in a braita. Remember we quoted a braita that gave all the cases of what is get achar get, right? And normally we were saying it's talking about one yabam and two yevamot, and he does get to one, and then get to another, ma'amar to one, ma'amar to another. And then the question is, right, what's the validity of all these things? And are they effective? Are they not effective? We talked about then also if he did, there were even three wives and he did ma'amar and then bi'ilah and then get. We had all different possibilities. So that's all discussed there. Then we move on to a new case. The ketzad is actually introducing a new case, which is yabam echad v'yivama achat ketzad hataratan. Our case is discussing what if you have one yabam and one yavama, not two, like the get achar get case, or three possibly, but one yabam, one yavama, but instead of doing the normal, what he should have done, like either just chalitza or yibum, he does ma'amar first, and then he, or get, and then ma'amar, or whatever order it is, he starts to do two different things to one yavama. What's the story? Then, ketzad hataratan, meaning, how do we get them out of this, right? How do we resolve the issue? So remember, like if he does ma'amar, then let's just go back to that first case. It was asama amar b'yivimto, and then gave her a get, right? That's not enough to get her out of chalitza, out of yibum. He still needs to give her to chalitza, right? And he can't do the yibum because he already gave her a get, right? And that's a problem. So now, that's what this section is talking about. Okay, so that's what they're going to read now, right? I should have looked inside. It's right here. I didn't need to look back. Now we go to the next. Okay, there were two cases mentioned. The third was asama amal uba'al harezo kemitzvata. If he does ma'amal and then does bi'ilah, now that's a perfect two actions, right? That's exactly what you're supposed to do. You're normally supposed to do ma'amar with her first, and then yibum. Okay, let's go back and discuss some things we learned a long time ago. By Torah law, and we saw this in the Braita, I think it was yesterday, that yibma means even if it's against her will. Remember, they learned from that word yibma, it could be against her will. So the rabbis, again, according to one of the opinions, the reason why ma'amar was instituted is to ensure that he doesn't do it against her will. We make him do a kiddushin, and a kiddushin is basically an action that she has to be a part of. So therefore, the kiddushin is with her will, Then the Yibum, we assume it's with her will. If she already willingly went into the Kiddushin, we'll assume that Ma'amar, which is like Kiddushin, we'll assume the Yibum was with her will. But if in the end he forces her to do Yibum and she doesn't really want to, it's effective because by Torah law, it's effective, okay? But you're supposed to do Ma'amar before to ensure that, and protect the woman and also make it a little bit less. And we'll see this today of a primitive act of, okay, I'm just sleeping with a woman without any sort of prearranged anything. So now, they say, if the Mishnah says, if you do ma'amar and then you do be'ilah, you have relations with her, that is kimitzvata. Sounds like that's the ideal way to do things. That's what it sounds like. So therefore they say, Lema Masea Leila Rav Huna. This seems to support Rav Huna, because what does Rav Huna say? Tama Rav Huna, mitzvat yevama, mikadesh v'achar kach boel. The way to do the mitzvah of Yibum is to first mikadesh, the ma'amal, do the betrothal, and then Boel, and then have intercourse. So it sounds like the Mishnah is a great support for what Rav Huna says. Remember, Rav Huna is an Amora. The Mishnah is in the time of the Tanaim. It's always good if you can support what you say from a Tanaitic source. It seems to really prove it. Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Ema af zeh kemitzvata. What they're saying is, even this is a way to do the mitzvah, meaning you can just do bi'ilah if you want, or you can do ma'amar and then be'ilah, and those are two equal possibilities. Okay, and it doesn't necessarily say that this is a better possibility. To which the Gemara says, pshita, isn't that very obvious? Why would you need to say this is also a possibility? Obviously, it's also a possibility. So they say, well, sal kadat hachamina, you might have thought the kevan de amar mar, since we had this statement, and this is why I mentioned the whole thing about the background. We learned this before. Hausema amar b'yivim to. Parchai menu zikat yivamim v'chala alav zikat erusim v'nisuin em alav mitzvah ka'avid kamashmala. This is a bit of a complicated line. What does this mean? It means that you might have thought either that there's two tracks. You can have a yibum track, and then yibum can be against her will, and you don't need ma'amar for that. If you go the ma'amar track, then maybe once you do ma'amal, you already get rid of the zika of the, like, he's no longer connected to anyone else, he's with you. And then maybe you would think she's now on a track of erusin and nisuin, which has to be done with her acceptance of it. So you might have thought that maybe once you do ma'amar, you're on a different track, and then maybe you don't do yibum at all. Maybe you need chuppah before you get married. And maybe you can't do it unless you do chuppah, right? Normally you would do a chuppah, that's your nisuin. Here, he just takes her home and consummates the marriage. So you might have thought maybe that's the situation, right? That maybe you wouldn't need yibum anymore if you did ma'amar. You would just need chuppah, nisuin. It wouldn't be yibum, kamash malan, that no. You're still on a yibum track. And again, as I said before, that means if he does it against her will, it would actually work. And as the ma'amar has to be with her acceptance, but if she decides later she's not interested and he has relations with her against her wishes, again, I wouldn't wish this upon anybody, but theoretically by Torah law, this would actually apply. Okay, so that's what it's trying to tell you. That ma'amar and then yibum is the track. It's not like you do ma'amar and then nisuin, and you're on a different track. And one track is yibum track, one track is ma'amar and nisuin. No. And then again, this all shows that this line, ma'amar and then be'ilah, harezo k'mitzvata, doesn't necessarily mean, it could mean that this is the ideal way to do it. It could just mean this is a way to do it, and it's trying to tell you that don't think ma'amar is followed by nisuin. No, ma'amar is still followed by yibum. Gufa. This is a bit of a repeat of a sugya we saw a while back with like a bit of a different twist, but it's the same idea. Gufa. Now we're going to go into the words of Rav Huna. Rav Huna said, and we're going to see something he says after that and deal with that. Mitzvah yivamim mekadesh v'achar kach boel. That's what we saw so far. The way to do yibum is first do ma'amal, which is kiddushin, right? A type of kiddushin. Then do be'ilah. Ve'im ba'al v'asa ma'amal kana. But if you did it the reverse order, first you have relations with her, then you did ma'amal, it would be effective. So now they say, im ba'al v'asa ma'amar pshita. Of course that would be effective. The ma'amar would be irrelevant, really, because you already did be'ilah. Remember, we learned ein achar be'ilah klum. You basically fulfilled the mitzvah. So of course, if you start with be'ilah, of course it works. So now they say, right, so that's pshita. So they say, well, right, to kakanya b'biyah, because obviously the biyah worked. Ela ein las, they say, no, what he meant to say was, im ba'al below ma'amal kana. That's what he was trying to say. His chiddush was that if you do be'ilah without ma'amar, in other words, again, ma'amar you're supposed to do. The rabbi said this is what you're supposed to do. But if for whatever reason you didn't, it's still effective. So now they say, how could you say that? And now we get something very interesting. V'hatanya lokeh. Doesn't it say in a Braita that if you take a woman who you're supposed to do yibum with, and you basically just go and have intercourse with her without this intermediary stage of doing ma'amar first, you get lashes. Now, lokeh, you have to understand the language. Lokeh always means Torah lashes, or usually it means that, okay, by Torah law. That seems very strange. First of all, how could it be by Torah law? Isn't Torah law that you just need yibum, right? So it's a little bit strange. And how could it be koneh if you're going to get lashes? So they say, makat mardut midrabanan. Now, it's not lokeh from the Torah. It means that by rabbinic law, we're going to give you lashes. In other words, this is fascinating because you have something that by Torah law it totally works. And the rabbis came and said, not only are we changing it, you have to do ma'amar first, but all the more so, we're going to give you lashes if you skip our step. Okay, this is very appropriate for Parshat Kedoshim, which in Israel, we're going to read this Shabbos, because what is Kedoshim, right? Kedoshim tiyu, al tiyu naval bereshut haTorah, right? Don't take the Torah and use it in inappropriate ways. Okay, now, and try to say, oh, well, I'm doing what the Torah said. So now we're going to have a long list, and it's really interesting, and although it's almost more interesting that we're going to have a different tradition of this whole thing in Nehardea, who thinks that Rav really didn't say this, okay? But we're going to say now that Rav Mangid, okay, we're going to have a long list. Mangid means he gave lashes to, okay, or he didn't actually give the lashes probably, but he said, you're going to get lashes if you do, and we're going to have a long list of things that majority of them are actually permitted by Torah law, but it's using the law to basically take advantage or do things in a non-appropriate manner. So number one, man de mekadesh b'bia. Okay, one who betroths a woman with bi'ah. There's three ways you can betroth a woman, right? Kesef, shtar, or bi'ah. So by law, having sexual relations in a way, right, to affect a marriage, it's totally fine, right, to get a betrothal. But the rabbi said, no, we're going to give you lashes if you do this, because obviously the same way we would all think, right? This is not the best way to betroth a woman. This is even more interesting. If you do it in the shuk, okay, now first of all, why is this interesting? So first of all, when we get to Kiddushin, right, the first Mishnah is going to kind of probably bother many of you. Ha'ishan niknet b'shlosha drachim, right? The woman is acquired in three ways, and then it goes to ha'eved niknet, ha'behema niknet, starts going into all sorts of kinyanim, acquiring. It doesn't sound very good. But what's amazing, the rabbis are basically saying she's not like an item in the shuk, and you don't purchase her in the shuk, and you don't do things like that. This is not, yes, it is a kinyan, but it's not that type of kinyan. It's a totally different one, and don't do it in the shuk. It's not appropriate. If you do it without a shidduch, okay, don't worry if you met your spouse and, without a shidduch, that's not what it means. What it means is, without some, it seems to anyway, without some pre-arranging of the families. You have to come to some agreement before. You don't just snap your fingers, get married in an instant, but there's some sort of preparation before and agreement before. Okay, we're moving out of Kiddushin now, moving to get. And this is right. These are all the things, favorite sugyot of mine we're going to get to in Gitin. Man de mevatel gita, one who cancels a get. Okay, this is a case where a man sends a get. Those who learn the Tikkun Olam, the Tikkun Olam Shiurim that we had in the skills classes. So we learned about this. Anyone who's interested, it's all online on our course website. But what's this case? This is a man who sends a messenger with a get. And then before the messenger gets there, he says, oh, you know what? I want to cancel the get. So Rav gave lashes to someone who does this because that's inappropriate, right? He basically is torturing his wife and making her, we call an aguna or a misurevet get. So anyone who does that, again, this is something that's perfectly allowed because in the end, he has to give a get willingly. And if he doesn't want to give it, he can cancel it. But the rabbi said, Rav came and said, we're going to give you lashes if you do this kind of thing. Next, man de masar moda'a agita. If you give a get, but you write down a note with the giving of the get, or you pass on the message to someone and you say, this get I'm giving is under duress. Now, you can't give a get under duress. You have to give it willingly. So if he says and gives this statement, I'm giving this get under duress, that's also going to be a problem, right? So Rav, again, it's perfectly valid. He can do it, but Rav is going to say, we're going to give you lashes for doing this. Because again, it's the same thing basically as mevatel get. It's just a different method. Now we're moving on to, right? So we started with kiddushin that seems to be inappropriate, or maybe very primitive, and not. Then we get to the bitul get. Now we're on another topic. Man de pakir shlicha de rabban. If a messenger of the court comes to your house and you say, I could care less, right? I'm ignoring you. It doesn't necessarily mean to your house or wherever, he, gives you a subpoena and you ignore it. This is a very interesting one. Someone who was put in excommunication by the rabbis for 30 days. You're supposed to go at the end of the 30 days to the court and say, please repeal my excommunication. If you don't do that, right, what does it show? It shows I could care less if the rabbis put me in excommunication. I'm disregarding anything you say. I don't really care if you repeal it. So you're going to get lashes for that. And maybe the most interesting, or I would say surprising of all of them, the other ones really make a lot of sense. This one is a bit surprising. A son-in-law who lives in his mother-in-law's house. Okay, I hope that, this doesn't apply. No, probably applies to people. It's very common that people do this, right? What's the issue? The issue seems to be that people are worried that the mother-in-law is going to have a thing for the son-in-law and something's going to transpire between them. And they think that in general, there's this tendency. Okay, now maybe you could think about it. In those days, they probably married very young and there might not have been such a big age gap. Anyway, it seems like an interesting thing that there's this concern that something will transpire between the son-in-law and the mother-in-law, and therefore better off he not live in the house. So now the Gemara says, we're going to talk about this last one for a minute. Didar in de chaliflo. It sounds like only if you live there, but if you pass by, it sounds like it's not a problem. But look at this case. There was a guy who passed by the door of his mother-in-law. Vinag de Rav Sheshet, and Rav Sheshet gave him lashes for this. That seems pretty harsh, and it doesn't seem to be what Rav said, because Rav said only if you live there. Well, we knew there was something going on in this case between them. It's interesting, Rav Sheshet was blind. So it's interesting, he understood that something was going on, right? Maybe it was very clear. And therefore, he gave him lashes. But normally, passing by the house would not be an issue. Obviously, this is not something that's probably likely relevant nowadays, but it's kind of interesting to see, right? Again, you get certain things about their culture, or at least about what the rabbis thought maybe was part of their culture. So yeah, Chamui is father-in-law. So it means the house of his father-in-law. Yeah, thank you for correcting me. It was the house of his father-in-law, but his mother-in-law is there, and that's the concern. Nehardea Amri. So I told you that in Nehardea, they were going to have a different version of Rav. So Rav gave lashes for all these, right? We could categorize them into Kiddushin issues, right, that are done kind of on the fly. Gitin issues where he's trying to cancel divorce documents. Then we had disrespect for the court. And then this last thing of concern something will happen between the son-in-law and the mother-in-law. Nehardea said, B'kulu lo mangi Rav. No, we don't really have this list at all. Rav really didn't give lashes for all these cases. It's only if he betrothed her with intercourse without having shiduche, without any sort of prearrangement. It sounds like anything else would be totally fine, or I shouldn't say it should be totally fine. He just didn't give lashes for it. He obviously didn't think they were appropriate, but he didn't go so far as to give lashes to people, according to Nehardea. And Ikadamre, some people say, you see how many different versions there were of what Rav did, afilu b'shiduche nami mishum pritzuta. That Mekadesh Babia, even if there was a shidduch before, is still a problem because that's pritzut, right? That's like inappropriate relations to basically take a woman and just betroth her with having sexual relations without any sort of, right, anything beforehand. That's just not a way to do it. Even though, right, by Torah law, it's pretty clear you can do it. So it's very interesting. Okay, next. Tanu Rabbanan, Ketzah Ma'amal. How do you do ma'amar? So now the Gemara is going to say, what are you talking about? Ma'amar is just kiddushin. We all know how to do ma'amar. Natama kesef or shave kesef, right? We know that. You give her money or something that's a value of money. That's what we do. We do a ring generally, right? A ring has value. Ubishtar ketzad. So maybe it meant, how do you do ma'amar if you're doing a shtar? But that also. Bishtar ketzad keda amaran. Katav la'alaniyar. O lacheres. Afa pishein bo shave pruta. Hareat mekudeshet li. You write on a piece of paper, or an earthenware shard, because in those days that they sometimes wrote on those. And even though it doesn't have value, in other words, if it had value in and of itself, that would be kesef, right? So it doesn't need to have any value, but you write on it. It's what's written on it that's important. You say hareat mikudeshet li, you write that on the document. That's totally fine. That we know already from Kiddushin. So we don't need you to tell us this. So what do they say? The question must have been, Amra Abaye Hachi Kamra. This is what he was asking. Shtar ktubat yivamim ketzad. Okay, even though he said, right, ketzad ma'amar, the Gemara, the Braita said, Abaye saying the question must have been, how do you do the ketubah of a yivama? Now, you might be thinking, if you remember, we learned she doesn't get a ketubah from the Abam. Why? Because the ketubah is from her first husband, right? But we're going to learn now that the ketubah has multiple things, and we'll get to this much more later. But a ketubah, number one, says, I'm going to support you and provide you with food and a place to live and all that while we're married. It also says, in the event of death or divorce, I will give you a big lump sum of money. So what we're now going to learn is he does give her a partial ketubah. So katavla, this is how it works. Katavla ana ploni bar ploni, I so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Kabilat yat ploni tivimti, I will take upon myself you, right? What about you? Alai, okay, yivimti, alai lazunitz on me to support, right? Lafarnasat, to give you food, to support you in any way you need, kara'ul, okay, in an appropriate manner. That he has to accept upon himself. But then it has this caveat. But as long as her ketubah is from the first husband's money, I'm not taking that upon myself. That the first husband already committed, which didn't happen right now because I'm marrying her, but in the event that I die or divorce her, she'll get the ketubah from the first husband's property. The late la mirishon, we already learned this. If he doesn't have any money, takinu la Rabbanit Michelle. So the rabbi said, then he has to give her the money. Why is that? So that he's not flippant about divorcing her, because if you can easily divorce her without any sort of penalty, right, any sort of financial commitment, it'll be much easier to divorce her, and we don't want to allow this. So basically, what happens is, okay, so I see you're asking, and we talked about this last time, about doesn't he inherit all the brother's money? So it's true he inherits all the brother's money, but the issue is like this. The money, when the first husband gave her a ketubah, his land is now liened to this property, to this ketubah. That means in the event that he sells his property, whoever buys the property has to ask him, do you have any liens on the property? Like you would do if you would buy property. So when they buy it, they know they're probably going to buy it for a better price because they know that in the event that he has no money left, she can go demand it from that field. So that's what it means. It comes from the first husband, because any possessions of the second husband aren't lien to the ketubah. Only the possessions of the first husband that he now inherits, but those are lien to it. So it's true he in the end has to pay the ketubah because he has the Yerusha, but if he doesn't have money to pay, it's going to come from the money of the first husband, the property. Like if he sold all his property, she can demand it from property only that the first husband sold and not property that the second husband sold. So when the second husband goes to sell property, he doesn't have an issue, right? Unless it's the first husband's property. So in a sense, he inherits it, but he inherits it with all of its, baggage that it comes with, okay? So first of all, we see something interesting here. We saw first about not being too quick to marry, and now we see not being too quick to divorce, right? They're basically saying, take this seriously, okay? Next, Bai minei Abai mirab. So Abai asked Rabba the following question. We're now going to have a bunch of cases of gitin, we talked about get. Let's go do some background. If a man gives his Yevamot a get, even though they're not married, right? So it's a little bit strange. We're going to talk about this in all different areas today. Number one, we said there's two main ramifications. Number one, he's now forbidden to all her relatives, just like any normal divorcee would be, even though there's no such thing as divorce for get, right? Because she's not married to him. But because there's Zika, right? And we'll talk about exactly what the get is undoing. But any sort of get is going to basically say, you're now forbidden to the relatives. He to her, it's her to him. Number two, it's a way of disconnecting, right? And remember, once you disconnect, you become forbidden to now do yibum with her. So if you give her a get, you now can't do yibum anymore. And we're going to see, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's a lotat, right? It's a negative commandment. According to Rabbi Akiva, remember, negative commandments, ein kiddushin tofsim. So after you do a get and you try to marry her, let's say, it's not going to work, okay? Because according to Rabbi Akiva anyway, because ein kiddushin tofsim. So now that's a little bit of background. Abai asked Rabbi the following question. Natan la get. Now, the first thing you have to realize is in a get, what's supposed to be written? Hareat megureshet hemeni. Okay, you're now divorced from me. So that means, you can't be with me anymore. But it also is basically saying, hareat muteret l'chol adam, right? You're now permitted to everybody. When you do erusin, kiddushin, right? Both the same thing. You basically say, you're now mine, You're not yet permitted to me. You have to wait for marriage, but you're now forbidden to everybody else in the world. So Gitin is undoing that and saying you're now permitted to everyone. So if you were to write a get in the following language, I means ein at muteret lekol adam, and you write, and you're not permitted to everyone. So in the world of Gitin, that's not a get, because that's exactly right. It's antithetical to the definition of get. So the question is, since anyway, this isn't a real get, is this enough to basically have the effects of a get on this Yibum relationship? Because he did say you're megureshet hemeni, which is disconnecting them, right? So the question is, Mahu, would this work? Do we say get Yevamot Rabbananhu, get mahani be'eshedish, mahani be'viyama? Right now, the rabbis instituted that a get to a Yevamot has effect. Right? That was all rabbinic. From the Torah, there's no such thing as a get to a Yevamot, because again, they're not married. The rabbi said, though, because get and chalitza are similar, we're worried people will confuse, so we're going to say that get has validity. So now, are we going to say, but what kind of get? If the rabbis institute something, they're going to institute it like Torah. So if there's a get that's not affected by Torah law, well, then probably it won't be effective here either, right? So when we say get to mahani be'eshedish, mahani be'viyama, if it works for eshedish, then it will work for a yevama as well, right? If it works for married, well, it's going to work for this case. Get to lo mahani be'eshedish, lo mahani be'viyama. That's one option. Option 2 is to say, odilma ate lechlufe begita. Or maybe we're worried that you'll confuse this with get, meaning if you give her this get, and it's not a valid get, but people see that you gave her a get, and then they see that tomorrow you go do yibum with her, they'll think that you could do yibum after get, okay? So therefore, even though it's an invalid document, nobody will know that it was an invalid get. So it'll look like you did get, and the yibum, that will make people think that if you do get and then do yibum, it's okay, and it's not. So those are the two sides. So he says, in fact, we worry, and therefore we're going to count this get as valid, even though, right, it's fascinating. Even though on a regular get, this wouldn't work, but for this, it works. To which Rabba Bar Hanan asks a great question. Rabba Bar Hanan, if you're worried about what it looks like. So so if he just gives her a piece of paper, nobody knows what's written in it, right? What's the difference between a blank piece of paper and this get, which is basically an invalid get? Right? You're basically saying if someone sees him handing her a piece of paper that has nothing written on it, it'll look like he gave her a get, and then he does even tomorrow, people will misconstrue. So they answer, Amar le hatam lo pasul b'kununa, hacha kapasul b'kununa. Here's something very interesting. If you give this get in a regular case where you're married, and you give a get to a woman that says hareat muteret l'chol adam, hareat migureshet hemeni, but you're not muteret l'chol adam. That is what's called, we're going to see in a minute, they call it reach haget. It looks like a get. And because it looks like a get, it's not actually a get, you're not divorced, but it disqualifies her for kahuna. Now, what would that mean? Let's say he dies the next day, okay? And now she's just a widow, not a divorcee. We're going to say she can't marry a Kohen. It's a crazy case, right? It's crazy that we're machmir in this way and she can't marry a Kohen. So we're going to read it right now. So that's the difference between if he gives her a blank piece of paper, that's not going to disqualify her for marrying a Kohen, but this get has validity somewhere. Okay, in some way it's valid in the sense it will disqualify her from marrying a Kohen. How do we know this? Titania, Isha gurusha me isha lo yikachu. Okay, this is a case where it talks about how you can't remarry your, that a Kohen can't marry someone who is divorced. But now it says grusha me isha. Now it could just say grusha. Why does it say me isha? Afilu lo nitgarsha ela me isha lo yikachu. Even if she was only divorced from her husband, meaning, and not permitted to anyone else, that's our case, right? Then, right, hainu reach haget shepasel b'kuna. So anything that seems like, right, she's disconnected from her husband, right, that will already disqualify her for kahuna, even if it's not actually a valid get. Amurami Barcham, another case now, a weird kind of get case. Hareamu, amar chalil lablan. So first they're going to tell us something that's known, and then also say, how does this apply to Yibum? If someone says to a lablar is a sofer, guy who writes gitin, tov get larusati, write a get for my wife that I'm betrothed to. Now remember, there is such a thing as get from a betrothal. But he says the following, as soon as I marry her, the divorce will kick in, okay, right? You can imagine going to that wedding. Not exactly a happy wedding, okay? They get married. Soon as the Sheva Baruch would happen under the chuppah, the whole, then she's immediately divorced. It's actually a valid document because At this point, he can divorce her right now if he wanted to, because he's engaged. Now, remember, betrothal needs divorce. If you decide you don't want to, right, this is why we don't do betrothal anymore before the wedding, because, right, broken engagements don't have any halachic ramifications. But broken halachic engagements, if you did erusin or kiddushin, right, they're synonymous, then you would need a get. So since he could do a get now, therefore we say this get is actually a valid get. But li'isha ba'alma ain't get. If the man goes up to a random woman on the street and says, listen, here's a get, right? This will be your get as soon as I marry you. But they're not anything yet. That's totally invalid because he can't divorce her now because they're not married. So therefore not. So here comes our question. By Rama Bar Chama. Liyavim tomau. Is the Yevamah, where does she fall in? Is she like a random woman on the street? On the other hand, how could she be random? She has Zika, right? So is she like an engaged woman, but she doesn't have Ma'amar yet? So how do we view her? So, since she's already connected to him, that's Zika, she's connected. Maybe she's like an Arusa. Or maybe since she didn't do Ma'amar yet, lo. And the obvious answer the Gemara gives is Teku, we don't know, because she's got elements of both. By Rav Chananya, another question about this get for Yevamah. Katav get lezikato velo lema'amaro, or lema'amaro velo lezikato. This woman is connected to him in two ways. Number one, okay, assuming he did ma'amar. So number one, there's Zika. As soon as the brother dies, we already learned this many times, there's this connection between them. Also, once he does ma'amar, he's even more connected to her. That's like a kiddush. Normally, if he gives a get, okay, let's say he already did ma'amar and he gives a get. We assume the get covers everything, right? The get is disconnecting them. And that's what we said. Now at this point, he can't marry her anymore, do yibum. But now they're suggesting, what if he did ma'amar and then he says, I'm giving you a get for the ma'amar. Now that theoretically could be just erasing ma'amar and there could still be Zika and he's not breaking the Zika, which would mean what? Which would mean that if he wants to marry her still, he could. Okay, if he decides to do yibum, he could do it. Why he would keep wavering, I don't know. This is, again, just pretty theoretical. The second thing is, what if he says, I'm giving you get from the Zika. Now, what would this mean? So now he can't marry her, but he already did ma'amar. So what would happen? He would need another get for the ma'amar because ma'amar can only be undone by get. So the question is, does this half get work? Does it work to say, I'm giving you a get just for the Zika or I'm giving you a get just for the ma'amar? So do you say, ma'amar ilave Zika karame? Ma'amar only works because there's Zika. We're going to get back to this also at the end of the daf. If there's no Zika, ma'amar is irrelevant, right? Because ma'amar isn't kiddushin. It's a kiddushin for Yevamah who already has this connection. So do we say that the ma'amar builds on the Zika? And therefore, if we do this, it's havele kimigaresh chatzi isha. It's like you're divorcing a woman only halfway. Because ma'amar builds on the Zika. So they're all one and the same. So if you say, I'm giving you a get for only one of them, they're a package. And that's basically divorcing half a woman. Now, you can't divorce half a woman. Why not? Because if you remember in the Torah, it says sefer kritut. It has to be something that fully disconnects them. So if you give a get that has a language that keeps you still connected to the woman, that's not a get. This, by the way, makes perfect sense, right? We all know if you've ever been in a relationship where, one side wants to break up and then this, and, it's never final. And well, maybe we'll get back together, right? That's the worst thing you want to know. You want a total disconnect. Otherwise you can't go moving on, right? Living your life. So it says here, if it's like a megaresh chatzisha, but megaresh chatzisha lo asava lo klum. O dilma, or maybe we say, and remember these two possibilities, so we're going to get back to them at the end of the daf. Hai lechudekai v'hai lechudekai. These are two totally different tracks. There's ma'amar and there's Zika, and you can view them each separately. So if you want to undo the ma'amar, go and do the ma'amar. You still have the Zika. You want to undo the Zika, you still have the ma'amar. You still have to, again, that would just mean you'd have to get rid of the ma'amar with the get. But this isn't a chatzi gerushin. It's a full gerushin because it's fully on that track. Okay, it would work. So they say, well, we have an obvious answer. Tifshal lemi de Rava, and it's why do you ask this question? You could have answered it from what Rava says. Ta'amar Rava. Natan get lema'amaro utrat harata. Okay, this was a case where there were three brothers. Okay, we saw this on Daf Lamed Bet. Rashi quotes it. There were three brothers. The first one died. The second one did ma'amar with, right? They were each married. So the second one's already married to one woman. He does ma'amar with the first brother. So Shimon does ma'amar with Reuven's wife. And then what happens? Then Shimon dies, but he only did ma'amar, right? So now the question is, does she belong to Reuven? and then he could do Yibum with both, Levi could do Yibum with both women because it's two separate brothers, or is she already Shimon's wife, and then he only does Yibum with one of the two? So it says here, if he gave a get to his ma'amar, then if he had given a get for the ma'amar, he would have undone the ma'amal, but the zika would still be there, right? And then her tzara would be exempt. So it seems like you could just give a get for ma'amal. So why are you asking this question? Rav already answered it. So they say, oh no, it has, just because Rava gave this answer doesn't mean I agree with Rava. I actually am deliberating whether this is the case or not. And the Gemara answers again, Teiku, we don't really know. Chalatz v'asama amal. Now we're going to get to this whole thing, how the Mishnah seems to hold by Rabbi Akiva, as I mentioned in the Mishnah before, when we learned the Mishnah, and I mentioned this morning also, because once, right, the whole idea of Rabbi Akiva is once you're forbidden to marry her because you did chalitza, for example, anything you do after is not going to be a valid kiddushin because it's chayve lavim, lo yivneh. Remember, he didn't build her house, so therefore he can't build her house. So therefore, any marriage they would do after that point would be an invalid marriage. It would be irrelevant. Because kiddushin ain't tovsim b'chayve lavim, only according to Rabbi Akiva, though. Other people say, right, kritud or mitot beitim, we've seen this machloket. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, zo divrei Rabbi Akiva. Okay, we're talking about chalatz, and then you did ma'amal. Okay, so we said, ein achar chalitza klum, right? Nothing can happen anymore after chalitza. So this is Rabbi Akiva Damar, ein kiddushin tovsim b'chayve lavim. He says, kiddushin are not valid if there's a chayve lav. Aval chachamim omrim, yesh achar chalitza klum. The rabbis say, if you went ahead and married her, that would be a valid marriage. You shouldn't, it's forbidden, but if you did it, the marriage would be valid, and you need to give her a get, basically, because you're not allowed to stay married to her, so we try to force you to give a get. So now they say, wait a minute, we're going to have a separate problem with Rabbi Akiva. Like Rabbi Akiva, you want to really say the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva? It says in the beginning of the Mishnah, Natan get v'asama amal, tzricha get v'chalitza. If you gave a get, and then you did ma'amar, you need get and chalitza. Rabbi Akiva, kevanti yav la get mi mahani ba'ma'amal. Once you give a get, there is no ma'amal. How do we know this? So they're going to prove it from somewhere else that we haven't seen before. Tanya, it says in a Braita, Rabbi Akiva Omer, this is the problem. He himself says, Minayin lenotein get liyivimto shene'esra alav olamit. How do you know that if you gave a get to your Yevamot, she's forbidden to him forever? Okay, now we're going to see it. It's from a pasuk in the Torah. That means it's a lo taseh and ein kiddushin tovsim. So when you give a get to your Yevamot, it's now forbidden by Torah law, negative prohibition, to marry her. So that means it shouldn't be valid. So why does it say if he did get and then ma'amar, you need another get? You shouldn't need a get. The ma'amar should be irrelevant because ein kiddushin tovsim. So what's the lo taseh? It's actually in a totally different context. Lo yuchal ba'ala rishon asher shilcha. So now it says, if you divorce a woman, this is machzir grushato, you can't remarry her if she's married to someone else in between. It says, Lo yuchal ba'ala rishon asher shilcha, who sent her off. Now, could have just said ba'ala rishon, obviously is the one who sent her off. They got divorced. So asher shilcha comes to teach you achar shiluach. It's anyone after shiluach, which means this Yevamot, after she got a get, would be included in this verse. So there, we're going to say, oh, there you have it. It's a lo taseh. If that's the case, well, lo taseh, we're now can no longer marry her, right? And therefore, any marriage he does with her is invalid. So if he did ma'amar, shouldn't be valid. So now we said no. Amar of Ashi get Yevamim midrabanan ukras machta ba'alma. We just connected it to the verse. Rabbi Akiva connected it to a verse, but it's only rabbinic. It's not to oraita. It's not a lo taseh, and therefore kiddushin are tovs. Tanya namihachi. Here's a braita to support it. From here, we're going to get off on a third approach of Rebbe, which is kind of in between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. Amar Rebbe. So this is the support. Our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Akiva. It says ein kiddushin tovsim, right? Shaya oseh chalutza ke'erva. Because he basically says anyone who does chalitza, she's now erva to the brother, right? Which means, right, that ein kiddushin tovsim. The rabbis would think there is, right? If you marry her, after the marriage will be valid. That is so far repetition. V'ani omer, comes Rebbe and he says, but I say something a little different. Ematai, I kind of agree with the rabbis, but I say the following. Only when bizman shekitcha l'shumishut. Oh, really, he's actually talking about Rabbi Akiva. He says, when would Rabbi Akiva work, I think? When he betrothed her for the purposes of marriage. Then the marriage would be, He's saying the rabbis. Sorry, I just got confused for a minute. When we say yesh achar chalitza klum is if, again, he was supposed to do yibum. Instead, he gave her a get, which means now disconnected. Now you can't marry her, or any of these cases in the Mishnah, really, right? Did one of these things disconnected him? He can no longer marry her. Chai ve'lavim. Now, if, okay, so actually, sorry, chalitza. He does chalitza first. My mistake. The case is chalitza. He does chalitza. She's done with yibum. Now he marries her. Okay, he betroths her for the purposes of a real marriage. In that case, we're going to say there is. Now I'm getting confused for a second. That's the case that's actually going to work. Okay, but right, that's yesh achar chalitza klum. But kidsha l'shum yivmut ein achar chalitza klum. But if he says I'm doing yibum now after he did chalitza, I'm betrothing you. I'm doing ma'amar in order to do yibum. That for sure not, because yibum can only work off of zika, and there is no zika anymore. Okay, so that's what we're going to say right now. Tanya Idach, there's another braita that says hacholetz liyivim tov v'chazar v'kidsha. Okay, so our exact case, he does chalitza and then he betroths her. Rebbe omer im kidsha l'shum yishud tzricha imenu get. Right, she's going to have to again. No one thinks they could stay married. It's just a matter, was the marriage valid? In which case, we need a divorce document. L'shum yivmut ein tzricha imenu get. Okay, this is the same thing we just said a minute ago. It's just another braita. You'll see something's a little different further on. So you don't need a get because there's no such thing as yibum once you've disconnected through chalitza. Chachamim omrim ben shekidsha l'shum yishut ben shekidsha l'shum yivmut tzricha imenu get. Here it seems clear that the rabbis disagree with this, right? And say, we don't hold that way. Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef comes now and says, right? It's not so clear why they brought this extra bright. But comes Rav Yosef and he compares this. My time at Rebbe. He says, what's the reason of Rebbe? It's like a case, basically we're going to say this was kiddushay ta'ut. It was a mistake because he thought he still needed to do yibum and he didn't. So he says it's just like you need some background here. A convert dies without children after the conversion. He doesn't have anyone to inherit him. So all of his possessions become hefker. How do I get hefker, right? I can pick it up and acquire it, or I can use it. I can hoe with a ma'adir, right? With a hoe. Okay, that's the case we're going to use. If I pick up a hoe of a ger's, not knowing it was a ger's, I thought it was mine, and I just hoed. Well, I wasn't planning to do a kinyan, right? Like that's what we call a kinyan b'ta'ut, right? I didn't really mean to make a kinyan there. So that's what he says. It's comparable to this case. It's where I thought I was doing yibum, but it wasn't yibum because I don't need to do yibum. So it's kind of similar, although Abai is going to reject the comparison entirely and said, no, it's not like that at all. Abai midame. Here he was attempting to acquire her. In the case of the Nichsei Ager, he hoed without the intention to acquire. So there was no acquiring because he didn't intend to acquire. Here he intended to acquire, he just did it in the wrong way. That would be valid, right? So there he says it's more similar to what? Halodami, if you're going to compare it to Oder b'Nichsei Ager, it's more like this case. L'Oder b'Nichsei Ager zeh b'kasavor shel ger acherhu. He thought it was this convert's property, and it turns out it was a different convert's property. So what's the difference? He intended to acquire, it works. So this is more like that, and it should work. So therefore, he says, since according to your comparison, it actually should work, I'm going to say Rebbe a little bit differently. El amar bai, hacha b'mayaskina. Ki gonda amarli, hitkadshi amarla. He said to her, hitkadshi li b'ma'amar yevamim. He said, but be betrothed to me with the way we do, right? Ma'amar, basically. Rebbe savar ma'amar ilave zika karam. Because he used the language of ma'amal, Rebbe holds, and I told you we'd come back to this, ma'amar only works when there's zika. And since you said I'm doing ma'amal, therefore, right, what's going to happen? Atay chalitza afkate lezika. The chalitza already undid the zika. And therefore, there's no way ma'amar could ever happen. But Rabbanan savre halachudekai v'halachudekai. There are two different tracks, right? There's zika and there's ma'amal. So the ma'amar can work even without zika because ma'amar is just a different track than zika. And therefore, the rabbis think even if you said ma'amar yivamim, this would be valid. So mikara ilo amar lihit kachili b'ma'amar yivamim ilo mahane. From the beginning, it would have worked if he had said that. Therefore, ashtanami mahane. Therefore, here it will work as well. So again, you see that split we had. Does ma'amar build only on zika, or can ma'amar be a separate track on its own? If it could be a separate track on its own, then even if you got rid of the zika, ma'amar would still be valid, and then you would need a get to get out of it. So that's the machloka between the rabbis and Rebbe, according to Abaye's understanding. According to Rav Yosef, it's just that you made a mistake, and it's like kiddushin b'ta'ut. According to Abaye, that's not the issue. It's that there's no zika for it to work for, and that's why Rebbe says it doesn't work in that case. With that, we'll finish for today. Tomorrow, we'll see Rabba has a different explanation. We'll start with that in tomorrow's class. Have a meaningful Yom HaShoah. We'll meet up tomorrow.